So this is my book, On Account of Darkness, and I've done a million of these to this day, from this coming out last spring. And today and yesterday, I think, being Black History Month, and some of the most intense stories in here, of course, have to do with the regional Black, Indigenous, and Japanese Canadian stories. But the title has to do with the Chatham Colored All-Stars, which if you've never heard about them, which you probably have recently. Yesterday they were denied entry yet again to the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, despite the fact that they were this year inducted into Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. And I won't get into too many of the politics on that because the Canadian Baseball Fame doesn't really like me. But the title, On Account of Darkness, comes from that team. So in 1934, the Chatham Colored All-Stars were an out away from winning the Ontario Championships. And because of who they were, the umpires didn't want to see that happen. So they called the game with a 3-2 score on account of darkness, despite the fact it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was definitely not dark. But the players on the team said the only reason that it was too dark is because there was 9 black baseball players on the field. So the title kind of has a double meaning, of course, if you think about it. And a lot of people, so I talk to people about the book because it is about sports, but it's not about sports. So if you hate sports altogether, no problem. The only game that's actually described in this book is the one I just told you about. The rest of it just happens to be people that played sports, and I really believe that it tells the stories of their lives and humanizes the issues, I guess, you know, the topics that are in here about who people are and what we deal with in the world. And it just uses sport, because I think that sport often is one of the least inclusive spaces in our society. So it talks about it through there. Hopefully that people will pick it up that might not otherwise talk about the issues that are here and learn something. But it is centered in Chatham, Kent, so pretty close by. The word Windsor appears in the book about 50 times. So I only know that because I actually searched it a couple days ago to make sure I was prepared for this. But, you know, our region in Windsor, Essex, and Chatham, Kent, there's not a heck of a lot of difference, whether it's politically, geographically, etc. So the stories that apply in one pretty much apply in the other. But I mean, I did prepare a whole variety of Windsor-based things to talk about. But I live in Erie Beach, which is right on the shores of Lake Erie, about 20 minutes outside of Chatham. Closest town you might have ever heard of is Blenheim. But I'm from Wallaceburg. That's where I grew up. And Wallaceburg is a tremendously unwelcoming place. That's what I can say about it. Growing up, that's my experience. I was taught to be racist. I was taught to be homophobic. I was taught to be transphobic. I was taught to be xenophobic. I was taught to be absolutely everything that I now work against every single day. I was taught it by my teachers, by my family, by my church, by my coaches, and I've spent the vast majority of my adult life unlearning those items, which is, it's never too late to do that, I guess. So I always like to start by reading a couple of little bits about my town, about Wallaceburg, so that you can understand where I'm coming from, I guess. So I start with something from chapter 2, which is called It Was Never Our Game. And that relates to the fact that we call lacrosse one of our Canadian national sports, but it was not a Canadian game in any way. Lacrosse is a French word. We should be probably referring to it as Begadaway, which is a more indigenous, the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe terms. or the Creator's Game. But anyways, I'll read you a little bit here about some of my Wallsburg experiences. A wave of smoke and stale beer would crawl across you, sticking to your hair and skin as you entered Sam's Hotel in Wallsburg, marking you. Above the bar and rented rooms were the drug addicts, the residents who validated the hotel moniker. On the main floor, the thud of music would fill your ears, slightly tinny with simultaneously too much bass. Nameless and hapless bodies rubbed against each other on the dance floor, watched by older men with crude mouths. On the right was a long bar lined with cheap liquor and bargain beer. To the left, there were a few pool tables. A dive bar that was only palatable in an inebriated low light. Sam's was not the kind of place you told your mother about, although she'd probably been there at some point as well. It was where we went when we wanted the darkness to hide us. Sam's Hotel was opened in 1947 as the Lord Selkirk Ballroom, named in honor of a man who devised a plan to expropriate nearby Indigenous lands for a Scottish settlement. Before my first visit, I was told to lower my gaze and walk straight through the back of the club where tables lined the dance floor near the stage. This is where the white people sat. I was taught not to make eye contact with the people who inhabited the front half of this space. This is where the Indigenous people were. Sam's had a reputation. This was where fights happened, where people got stabbed. I never did see a stabbing, but I saw fights and I saw someone run down by a car in the parking lot right next to the No Frills grocery store shopping cart return. And I read headline after headline about assault, attempted murder, and more. As the clock crept past midnight, pores filled with smoke and cells swelled with alcohol. The intolerance held in the fatty parts of our body was released as muscle memory moved opponents from the dance floor to the parking lot. Sometimes it was one person fighting another. Sometimes it was group versus group. Always white versus Indigenous. I'm not sure I ever knew a motive. It was years before I realized I didn't know how we'd got here, how Canada had got here. So I like to start with that one because the theme of the book in general is our Canadian ambivalence or our false reputation as an all-welcoming, all-inclusive country, which of course we are not. If you look at our history, we were equally guilty of slavery and segregation. We were equally guilty of residential schools. We were equally guilty of Japanese internment camps. And nothing that we say about the people that are 15 minutes or 5 minutes, I guess, here to that side of us is not necessarily about ourselves either. It's a made-up border that we drew in the line, a line in the sand, and here we are from that. But it is not really who we are. It's kind of this false narrative that we've put ourselves forward in front of other people in the world, and everything that we do here is very similar to them, just maybe not as out in the media. So I'm going to read you one more small bit about Wallsburg before I actually dive into what the book is about, some of the stories historically. And this one's from chapter 13, and it's called Sundown Town. In Wallsburg, sunset can be a beautiful time, especially along the Sydenham River. A town of roughly 10,000 people, Wallsburg was built on manufacturing. The famous Louisville Slugger baseball bats and Louisville hockey sticks were both made here. Hall of Famers like Mark Messier, Steve Yzerman, and Brett Hull would all visit to test their new hockey sticks. Wallsburg is connected by waterways to the Great Lakes. On summer days, the brown water slowly meanders through town and long shadows creep out of the poplar trees. The quiet interrupted only by the sound of car tires rumbling across the 4 main bridges. Light shimmers in the wake of small boats driven by town teenagers, and kids sneak onto the old train bridge to drink cheap beer and swim in the turbid waters. There's almost certainly a father and son standing behind the local library fishing from the boardwalk. In the center of town is a walking bridge where pedestrians can wave at boaters and teens can steal a kiss in the fading light, and where a black taxi cab driver was threatened with lynching if he dared stay overnight in the town. So Wallsburg, much like Leamington, much like Blenheim, much like many of the towns around here, was a sundown town, which basically meant that black people were not welcome to stay in town after dark. Wallsburg did not have that on their books, but in 1957, a man named Rollie Miles, who was a famed black football player. He played in Edmonton in the CFL. He visited town on something that's called Brotherhood Week, and it was a time when service clubs like the the Legion or the Kinsman Club or whatever clubs you have in town, they all got together and said that they were there for brotherhood, to include and welcome everyone. So Rollie came to town in 1957 and he stood up at a podium like this in front of a room of hundreds of white business leaders and town leaders, and said that I know that by standing here, I'm breaking the law. I've never been a lawbreaker in my life, but just by being here after dinner, after sunset, I realize I'm breaking your town rules. So if you'd like me to leave, I will. Otherwise, you need to change your laws. And I've got a picture from that exact moment where his son, Brett, sent me this picture. And the faces of the people looking at Rollie as he says this are shocked, upset, horrified, but probably know exactly what he's talking about. So the mayor takes him to the town hall, they go through the books, they can't find any law that says that black people can't be in Wallaceburg after dark. But of course, sundown towns were mostly enforced by the citizens, by realtors not selling to black populations, by banks not giving loans, a whole variety of things, intimidation as the story tells you. And so, Rollie comes back and ends up speaking, but goes through the whole idea of how change needs to happen. And much like the Colin Kaepernicks of today and things like that, it started a discussion. And about 2 days later in the newspaper, the Wallaceburg mayor went on record and said that any person, regardless of your creed, race, religion, background, etc., is welcome to live in Wallaceburg. And the very next year, the first ever black family moved into the city limits in Wallaceburg. So, it's a very impactful, truthful story. And Wallaceburg and, like I said, Leamington being a very prominent example of a sundown town locally, had the same rules. So I could read you a million of these stories. Every chapter in this book starts with a personal recollection, something that connects to me. And the reason behind that is that I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours sitting in front of people with a tape recorder going, listening or talking or crying or whatever it might have been at that moment. But with people from Chatham-Kent's Black Historical Society and Black American Museum, North Buxton, what used to be Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is now the Josiah Henson Museum for African Canadian History, our Indigenous communities in Walpole Island and Delaware Nation. And I just listened. And what I always say about this book, because if you put your hand up right now, which you don't need to, the first question should always be, why is there a white guy in front of me talking about a book on racism? No. And it's, I really, really focus on the idea that I approach this from a story preservationist standpoint, not from a storytelling standpoint, because it's not my story. But in talking to Black leaders and Indigenous leaders in our communities, they said, your story is very important to tell. Place yourself in this book. And so I placed myself in this book firmly as part of the problem for the vast majority of my life. And even now, I'm not perfect. I still have biases like every other person, but each chapter starts with something that impacted me, that taught me about the horrific things I learned. And so I'm in there, just like the people who I hurt are in here. And I'll tell you about one of those stories later. But in terms of Windsor and Essex, there is a lot of ties here. So the Chatham Colored All-Stars that are the title of the book, they played in Windsor. They played in 1936 here against Joe Louis's Brown Bombers as part of Emancipation Day celebrations in Jackson Park. They had multiple Windsor members on their team. And the person I'd like to talk about the most from this book that has a Windsor connection is named Wilfred Boomer Harding. And Boomer is one of the last his family is one of the last remaining people that actually remember this team. But Boomer was a fantastic baseball player, and he was also a fantastic hockey player, which as a black man in the 1940s is,
very rare.
Yeah, very rare. Let's just jump right to the truth. Very rare. But he went to, so in 1944, he tried to skate at Olympia Stadium in Detroit, and he was turned away right at the gates of the ice with his sisters, including his sister Beulah, who was very close friends with Joe Louis himself. And they were told by the arena attendant that public skating meant white, and that this was not public. So Boomer, they went home, and that is the times. But then 2 years later, Boomer went to war. He fought for Canada. He went overseas. He played for this army team, and a member of the Detroit Red Wings at the time thought that Boomer was a spectacular player. So he called home and got the Detroit Hockey Club to sign him. And however, they didn't know that Wilfred Harding was a black man. So when they found out, they immediately traded him to the Windsor Staffords. So Boomer ended up playing in 1946 for the Windsor Staffords. And that season, he became the first ever black man to play in the International Hockey League and the first ever black man to skate at Detroit's Olympia Stadium. Because even though 2 years before they turned him away, they could not turn him away as a member of the Windsor Staffords. So that was a pretty spectacular accomplishment from Boomer. But Boomer, even being in Windsor, it was not a simple story for him. The owner of the Windsor Staffords at the time had a rule that if you scored a hat trick, so three goals in a game, he would give you a fancy fedora hat that you could wear for the rest of the season to showcase your successes. So Boomer, early in the season, stepped on the ice and he scored 2 goals early. And he returned to the bench, probably feeling fantastic, only to not ever step on the ice again for the rest of the game.
Oh, no way.
Because he would not score a 3rd goal under the watch of the team's coaching staff and ownership.
Oh my God.
And he did it again a couple days later and found out that he couldn't score a hat trick. So Boomer went about, it didn't matter how open he was, how obvious the goal was. He spent the vast majority of his time passing to his teammates. And in the 3rd period, he would try and play, because if he scored 2 goals in the 3rd, at least he would only sit the last few minutes of the game instead of sitting the entire game. So in that way, Boomer,
He was still okay because he got to play.
he got to play.
Right.
And he broke ground in a way, 12 years before Willie O'Ree broke the NHL's color barrier. So he's one of those very untalked about pioneers of hockey in Canada, that it's very sad that we don't know more about Wilfred Boomer Harding. It's an extreme accomplishment for him to have played professional hockey at that era. And it's a wide variety of these stories. So people in the room that were adults in the 1970s, does anybody remember where you were when Paul Henderson scored his famous goal?
No.
No? Okay. So, okay, all right, we're not hockey fans, that's fine. Do we know who Paul Henderson is?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right.
I'm a
Okay.
hockey fan, I
All
just
right.
don't know where I was.
Okay, so.
I'm a Red Wings fan, but I'm leaving.
Yeah, I'm a
Maple
Red Wings fan
Leafs.
too, and it's been a sad couple of years, but we're gonna get back out of that,
We
so.
will.
I know who he is because they spoke of him, but outside.
Okay, so Paul Henderson, 1972, scores the famous Summit Series goal. It's immortalized on a Canadian stamp in every place that you could ever go, to beat, the Russian team, and it was a very political event. So this is kind of immortalized as one of the greatest goals, the most significantly political sports actions in Canadian history. And so I like to talk about that one because the alternative side of that is actually a Chinese Canadian man who no one almost has heard of, named George Chin. So George Chin in 1946 played in the inaugural season of the Windsor Spitfires, which you of course probably know what the Windsor Spitfires are. But 2 years before that, George Chin and his brothers from Lucknow, Ontario, were invited to try out for the Toronto Maple Leafs. They went to Owen Sound that year and skated with the Maple Leafs, and they impressed everyone. However, of course, George Chin, being the best of his brothers, was visibly Chinese Canadian, and so he would never get the opportunity to play in the NHL. It was 2 years before another Chinese Canadian man named Larry Kwong broke the unofficial color barrier in the NHL. There's actually some debate about who actually broke it, because there's a indigenous man named Taffy Abels who now is kind of believed to have broken it about 20 years before that. But anyways, George Chin, being from Lucknow, was from the same hometown as Paul Henderson. And Paul Henderson was gifted his first ever set of hockey equipment by the Chin family. 10 siblings. The parents ran a restaurant in Lucknow, Ontario. And the Chins coached Paul Henderson from the time he was a little boy until the time he made junior hockey and moved away from Lucknow. He learned how to skate and how to stick handle on the frozen floor of the basement of the Chin's family restaurant. And George Chin was cut from the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1944. And a few decades later, Paul Henderson spent about 10 years playing for the Maple Leafs before scoring that famous Canadian goal. So the history of Canada's hockey, this game that we tie so tightly to our national identity, would have been completely different without a Chinese Canadian family and the Chin brothers, who coached them all the way through, and then eventually ended up playing for the Windsor Spitfires because National Hockey League teams would not take him, and then moved across the border to play for the Michigan Wolverines, actually, and was still a fabulous, incredible hockey player, but never to the acclaim of Paul Henderson, who would have never got a start in hockey without receiving a free 7-foot from the Chins. So we can tie this whole region into so many important Canadian stories that, again, we forget about and we don't talk about. And sport plays this role in it, that we talk about sports as being this amazing thing that we all have the opportunity to do that helps us mentally and physically. But that's, of course, just another thing that we've made up. I often talk about, when I do media events and things, of sport as a weapon, which is not necessarily a very well-received analogy. But the brief example I'll give you is that at residential schools, hockey was introduced as a way to make Indigenous youth feel more Canadian. It was tied so tightly to our national identity that when Indigenous youth came there, to make them feel Canadian, to abandon traditional culture and practices and stuff, they thought of the most quintessentially Canadian thing that they could do. Yeah. So hockey was introduced. If television was around, or the radio, they would gather Indigenous youth into a room, probably about the size of this one, and they'd turn on every Saturday night, Hockey Night in Canada. And that was the allowable opportunity to connect to the outside world. And then, of course, if you've ever watched some of the movies like Indian Horse and things like that, or read the books, hockey was then also used as a disciplinary tool. So when the youth fell in love with the game, as they naturally would because it's fun, it could easily be taken away for any variety of reasons. And the rules themselves, whether we like to think it or not, could be thought of as kind of a colonial thing, right? Conquering people, beating people, dominating others. When the original purpose of sport was for us to feel good and to improve improve our mental health and to stay physically fit and healthy. Lacrosse itself was often referred to as medicine by Indigenous populations because it was such a spiritual game that it was healing. And we have abandoned all of that through sport to be this thing where we must dominate and be better than our opponents. And you see that when people complain that every kid gets a trophy nowadays, or they don't keep score in Tim at soccer. Well, if my kid's out there running and smiling, that's the whole purpose, So it's a really toxic kind of thing that our society has brought in, but that is what it is. So there's so many stories in here about Windsor, and another one that I want to tell you is about a man named Arthur Pelkey. So Arthur Pelkey was a boxer. He fought, he was attempting to get an opportunity to fight the great Jack Johnson. And if you know Jack Johnson, he was the heavyweight champion of the world. He defeated another, actually a Canadian man, Tommy Burns, and so when he did that, it sparked outrage among white populations worldwide. And it became this thing where they created this tournament structure where he was now labeled as the black heavyweight champion of the world, and they decided that they were going to find the great white hopes. And if you've ever heard that phrase, this is a racist, sports-related boxing term, where the idea of creating the great white hopes was that they would find a white boxing champion who could, and this is a quote, not my words, vanquish the black champion. As if this were, comic books, good versus evil kind of vanquishing. So Arthur Pelkey, who's from Pancora, Ontario, about 10 minutes outside of Chatham. It's a French-speaking community, if you know where that is. You can look it up if you don't. But he ended up living in Windsor for the end of his life. But anyways, Arthur Pelkey went to a tournament in New York City. He fought, he attempted to become a great white hope. He later gained that title by defeating a man named Luther McCarthy and actually killing him in the ring. In 1913.
The fight where they kept continuing to go?
It's a horrific story.
Yeah.
Anyways, Arthur is charged with manslaughter from this. He has a horrific breakdown because of what he's done. And he ends up losing his next 9 fights and dying in Windsor while working for the Windsor Police Department at age 38. But his title, after unfortunately killing that man, was that he was the Great White Hope, which his role was to beat Jack Johnson. And eventually a man named Jim Jeffries came back. He was the white champion of the world and tried to fight Jack Johnson, and of course lost. And this story is kind of perpetuated later in history as well through Joe Louis, who, if you think about Joe Louis Arena right across the border, fought the German fighter Max Scherzer, and it became this infamous thing where, you can read Maya Angelou and read these quotes of how this was, the whole world was sitting, waiting, hoping for Joe Louis to be successful against, a noted Nazi sympathizer. And Joe Louis won, which is incredible, but it was, lost the first fight, won the second fight. But, that's where history goes. And actually, the gloves from that fight, I told you about Boomer Harding and his sister, who was turned away at Joe Louis Arena. Her name was Beulah, and her married name was Beulah Cousins. And she was actually gifted the gloves from Joe Louis's loss against Max. And so they're in the Smithsonian in Washington, but a woman from Buxton that lived here in Windsor and served tea to Joe Louis was given those gloves. So the richness of history in this area to all of these stories is incredible. And it's Black History Month, so I kind of chose to focus on some of those Another man that I like to talk about from here, because his sister Dorothy, if you read the intro to this, I love storytelling because my grandparents were wonderful storytellers. I would sit at their dining room table and they would tell me, I always like to see the same stories told again, because you know, as you get older, you end up telling the same stories over and over and over, and your kids and grandkids and whoever else probably knows those stories off by heart. And I could tell my grandparents' stories off by heart. I could tell when my grandpa and my grandma were going to switch roles and finish each other's sentences and who would laugh at what point, and all of these things, you know, like it was such an intimate kind of thing where you understood every nuance. And then my beloved little grandma passed away, and I realized very quickly that she was the story keeper and my grandpa was just a participant, and his mind went very quickly after that. And I lost so many of those important little things that I held on to so dearly about their stories. Just the small things, you know, I still remember the dates and the places and the names of people, but I don't remember when one of them signaled the other person to take over and what their voices sounded like at certain parts of it. And so when I met Dorothy Wright Wallace, who is the longtime president of the Chatham-Kent Black Historical Society, she was the spitting image of my grandma, just this carbon copy. And we fell into this just beautiful rhythm of talking, and you know, like every bit that we were in. And there's a spot in here where I actually say that while I was sitting at the table with her, both my grandparents, you know, eventually went blind and could barely, you know, they knew your voice when you got there, and that's about it. So there's a point where she's telling me a story, and I remember sweeping the table with my hand, thinking I was wiping the crumbs off of my own grandparents' table. I remember thinking that and looking at her, and then, you know, I stood up and I put my arm on her shoulder because she was about this tall, just like my grandma. And so we have just like, you know, formed this wonderful relationship. But her brother is a man named Eddie Wright. Eddie Wright was the first ever black NCAA hockey coach and the first ever black NHL hockey scout. And he's from Chatham. And he played in Windsor and he played in Leamington, and he faced immense racism here, in particular in Essex County. And Dorothy never saw her brother play hockey once in his life. And the reason for that was because Eddie always claimed, and Eddie's still alive, he lives in Arizona right now, that he couldn't focus on doing what he wanted to do on the ice if he knew he might also have to protect his sister who was in the stands, or that she would have to listen to the things he was called while he was on the ice. In fact, the only person in his family of 6 siblings that ever saw him play was his brother Alan, who was a boxer, and got into a very vicious fight here in Windsor at the old Windsor Arena, as the crowd chanted the N-word at Eddie on the ice. So, you know, we claim all these things about ourselves, but none of our communities are immune. And the biggest part of this for me writing about Chatham-Kent was that Chatham-Kent gets this history of being the site of 2 incredible spots on the Underground Railroad. There we've got Buxton, we've got the Josiah Henson site, the Don settlement, the Elgin settlement would be what they should be called, not what we've referred to them as today. But at that point, they were, you know, for many years, Chatham had something like 75% more black residents than Toronto, which is, I think, pretty incredible. You know, like that's a wow. Like if you think about, you know, the 10 million people living in Toronto now compared to the 100,000 in Chatham-Kent as a whole, that's pretty impressive in my mind. But Chatham also fought vehemently against black settlement. A man named Edmund Larwell, and later a man named H.A. Tanzer, who are both featured prominently in here. And Tanzer spoke many times in Windsor, and he was a famous eugenicist. And if you watch anything to do with, if you listen to any, I don't know how to say this nicely, but, you know, the most racist of racists, far-right people in Alabama and Mississippi, they're going to be quoting H.A. Tanzer's papers to this day. And that's problematic. And he was also the director of education for all schools in Chatham-Kent. So if you wonder why we have systemic racism, well, the person that was in charge of all education was a horrific racist. Another name that's prominently in this book that has a Windsor connection, more so for the fact that he kind of became a minor celebrity, is Bob Azumi. And I'm not sure if you ever watched Hockey Night in Canada, but right before that in Windsor, usually Bob Azumi's Real Fishing would come on. Yep. And you know, whether or not you actually liked fishing, he was here in your TV screens, and he his family came through Japanese internment camps. His father, Joe, was a gardener Japanese gardener in Vancouver. And the Wakabayashi family is featured heavily in here. Toki Sugiyama and her family are talked about here. But of course, you know, when World War II, the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened, Japanese Canadians were thought of as other, or as a threat, despite the fact that many of the families that were being portrayed in that way had been in Canada far longer than people that were doing these things. And you know, they were forcefully dispossessed from their homes in British Columbia to internment camps or work sites. And Bob's father, Joe, was sent to this area. He originally was in the Essex County area working on farms, and then he ended up just outside of Rondo Provincial Park at Eatonville, where his role was to build roads in Rondo Provincial Park. And he stood on the shores of Rondo Provincial Park looking out at the bay and Lake Erie, and remembered his days of fishing on Vancouver Island, and thought how beautiful it would be that one day he could bring his family back to a spot that looked like this, if not back in Vancouver, or in British Columbia, I guess. So anyways, you know, several years later, he gets married and has kids, and he brings his family from Toronto to Blenheim, Ontario, which is right beside Rondo Provincial Park. And he raises the Azumi family there. His wife, who is a white woman, leaves him very shortly after, with Bob being 6 months old. And so Joe raises his 4 children in Chatham-Kent by himself. All of his kids fish, and they love fishing. And they are, you know, after their fishing, which Joe founded the first ever professional bass fishing tournament in Canada, which is pretty incredible.
That's pretty big now.
It's a pretty big thing. You know, like he did that in Rondo Bay, and you know, his daughter Lynn and his son Wayne are these incredible fishers, and Bob, of course, becomes the most famous of all. Not without a horrific amount of racism involved, because the anti-Japanese Canadian sentiment in Chatham-Kent was about as fervent as the anti-black racism was. And when you read the book, if you've never heard the Dresden story and the segregation of Dresden, Ontario, there would be no human rights code and Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada without what happened in Dresden, Ontario to fight against segregation after segregation became legal in that city, and people like Hugh Burnett that fought incredible human rights battles there. But the Azumi family, anyways, they you know, end up being there. Bob knows very little about this because he was the baby of the family, but the rest of his family knows it very well. And the Wakabayashis that are talked about in the book are both Herb and Mallard, born in internment camps and end up moving to Chatham. Chatham had a large Japanese Canadian population, but you know, it's just another story of how we don't think about what our role was. Chatham-Kent had 5 Japanese internment camps.
Wow.
5. The reasoning is because we had sugar beets, and sugar beets were considered a wartime necessity. So people were brought there to farm, to build roads, to work. And you know, Joe Azumi ended up being a chef at the local hospital in Chatham. And funny enough, he meets a black man from Chatham whose name is Ferguson Jenkins Sr. and who was a chef at the Holiday Inn and other places in Chatham. And Ferguson Jenkins Sr. played for the Chatham Colored All-Stars. And his son, Fergie Jenkins, is the first ever Canadian inducted to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Coopersville. He's just had a statue of himself erected outside of Wrigley Field in Chicago for the Chicago Cubs. He's one of the greatest baseball players that's ever lived. But as I started writing this whole thing, all of these stories, it didn't matter if we were talking about Japanese, Canadian, Black, or Indigenous people, they tied together so magically that you could not believe who knew who and the stories that we were told. And because I got back to Fergie here, I'm going to read you a brief 2 paragraph snippet that I like to read about Fergie. And it's from chapter 16, which is titled A Parade for Fergie. So this is from the year after Fergie played I believe it was his second Major League Baseball season, his first 20-win season. They held a big parade in Chatham, but that's not what the story's about. I only ever read my own words, except for one bit that I've been given very explicit permission to read, because I will not put my voice onto the words of racialized people. I will read my own stories, and that's it. You're gonna have to read the book if you want to read the other ones. So, anyways, this is called From A Parade for Fergie. So it says, for years I would follow the same truck on my way to work. The driver and I likely woke at almost the same time, checked the same weather reports. Maybe we sat down at similar tables and drank our coffee, and then stood to gather our coats and shoes. The darkest hours seemed to be those just prior to sunrise, my turn signal illuminating the world in intervals. As I pulled onto the highway, the man in his truck would pull out ahead of me like clockwork. I could see his eyes in the glow of my headlights on his rearview mirror. There in the darkness, on the road in front of me, he'd accelerate. My beams would strike the tailgate of his truck and bring to life the Confederate flag painted there. Each morning, I wondered about that man. We're in Canada after all. This flag had no geographic origin here, but it did have meaning. Eventually, the driver of the truck would pass a sign reading, "Welcome to Chatham, home of Fergie Jenkins." So I always thought that was such a fascinating thing, because I did live in this little tiny rural village, and I'd pull out every morning, and I'm not talking about a sticker, I'm talking his entire tailgate was painted as a Confederate flag. And I would follow him all the way to work. And we'd pass the same sign, and I thought, it's so interesting to go into a city that's known for its Black history, that has a sign that says, "Welcome to Chatham, home of Fergie Jenkins," this famed Black athlete, and to be that way. And what did that mean? And why did he do that? And there's another story in here about me going to Dresden Raceway, which celebrated 2 years ago their first ever Black Heritage Day, honoring the many Black horse trainers, drivers of the, you'd say jockeys, because it wasn't jockeys there, they were driving, the
Sulkies.
yeah, thank you, perfect. But Dresden has this famed horse racing, and I remember driving there on Emancipation Day, and I thought it was a beautiful day, so I took some back roads, and someone was up on a ladder, and they were hammering up to their barn a Confederate flag, about 5 minutes outside of Dresden. And I thought, there's no confusing that for anything other than what it is. And in the States, of course, that symbol is debated, and I'm not sure how that's possible, but yeah. Yeah, right. Right, exactly. So, yes.
They were taken down because they were Confederate
Right.
soldiers.
Because when we were driving from
Whatever.
Tennessee
Yeah.
and down into Mississippi,
Yeah.
you've seen it flying.
It's all
Oh, yeah,
over
they
the
do.
place.
That's what I'm saying, but they allow it, right?
They
You go to
do.
Mississippi, it's there.
That's what I'm saying. When we were there, it was everywhere.
You don't, yeah.
So in Dresden, it's ongoing because last year or the year
But I
before, they
never
had a
really seen it
film
in
crew
Canada.
come from Toronto that was going to film some Black history in Dresden, and a woman from Toronto came up, and she was going to go into the historic Baptist church there, and an old white woman walked out and said, "Go back to where you came from." And then for 2 straight days during that time, they had their Black Lives Matter flag pulled down and put in the garbage. And this is not the part about this is that we're reading about history, but we're also reading about our exact presence, and it's all there, and it's all so pertinent to where we are right now. Because if we can't
It's just coming
understand,
back.
if we can't understand why it started
But
in
it's
the
never
first place,
left.
it hasn't left. The similarities between Alberta and Southwestern Ontario aren't that great, but it's to shut up
Yeah.
and to listen.
Yeah.
And as soon as I started listening, the stories that came out that I had no idea, and everything in here. There's a story about this Pat Cosby, whose mom was Toki Sugiyama. He lives about 500 meters down the road from me, and I had no idea who he was until I saw this picture of the Blenheim Blades junior hockey team, and there was 2 Japanese Canadian guys and 2 black guys on the team. And I went and talked to him, and he gave me this photo album of his mother at Tashmene internment camp, and he basically said, when I die, this is gonna go in the garbage, so please take it. And I remember picking up my satchel with these pictures in it, and I just felt like, just this immense weight across my shoulder of carrying his story and his mother's story, and being the person that was keeping it. And that's why I say, story preservationist. So, and the good news is those pictures are prominently on display at the Tashmene Internment Camp Museum right now. The Japanese Canadian Museum is there, and that felt really good. But it was like there's picking up these stories. There was a lot of weight. The other tie that in Windsor I would like to tell about, which I don't want to take too much more of your time, but the Henry Ford, a story I guess that Jackie Robinson. So here's a famous name, but the man who actually got Jackie Robinson to Major League Baseball, his family's from just outside of Dresden. Wendell Smith, and he was a famous black journalist, and he wrote in Pittsburgh, and he wrote about sports mostly, but he felt like Jackie Robinson had a trait that he could withstand what it would take to break that barrier. And not that Jackie Robinson was the best player in the leagues at the time, but he had what Wendell thought was going to be needed. And so Wendell's dad, though, John Smith, was from Dresden, and ended up being the personal chef of Henry Ford, which of course Henry Ford was an awful man.
Not from the history
I know. And Henry Ford, so if you read the book, Henry Ford actually, his life was saved by the family of the first ever Indigenous man to play Major League Baseball at Penance, because his yacht crashed into the ice in the early spring just off the shores of Walpole First Nation, and the Penance family went out in canoes and pulled him in, and they brought him to the church that was there. And Henry Ford then, a couple of years later, donated the first ever automobiles to be on Walpole Island, which seems like a very gracious thing, except for the fact that he also donated several combines and tractors and plows, which led to the domestication of and the environmental destruction of Walpole Island First Nation, which was one of the most incredible ecologically diverse spots in the entire world. And if you ever get to go there and actually get off of the main road that takes you to the ferry, please do, because it is just beautiful. That's what it's all about. I became a teacher, and I had all these views of the world until that moment. And then when I got in a classroom with black students, Muslim students, it didn't matter who, Indigenous students, LGBTQ plus students, I started viewing people as these, and seeing their identities as wonderful and as empowering. We can talk about anything you want. But Wallaceburg, being right beside Walpole Island First Nation, was extremely anti-Indigenous. I knew every racist joke you could ever, and they're not jokes, every racist comment that you could ever know about Indigenous people. In my school, there was a hallway where the Indigenous people sat, and there was a hallway, you know, where the white people sat. If you went into the wrong hallway, you were gonna get the crap beat out of you. And there's lots of stories like that in this book, but one of the most powerful ones, and my favorite story from this whole thing, personal experience-wise, is that I met this man named Bill Sands, and Bill was a residential school survivor, famous hunting and fishing guide for something like 7 prime ministers and presidents, you know, Bobby or Gordie Howe, if you name a famous celebrity that liked hunting or fishing, he guided them in Walpole Island. And so Bill told me these stories about the indigenous spirit horses, the Ojibwe spirit horses that used to live wild on Walpole Island and were slaughtered off, and told me about his time at Mohawk Institute near Brantford. And yeah, wow. So anyways, yeah, Bill, we talked forever, and you know, it was never so impactful to me because I got to meet him and his son Derek and his daughter Alyssa, and one day they invited me out to Walpole Island, and I got in Alyssa's Jeep with Bill, and they took me around and showed me, you know, where Alyssa shot her first deer and where he used to guide and all these things. And I won't read it because again, it uses Alyssa's words, and I really don't love doing that. But we're out there, we talked about everything. We talked about the invasive species, we talked about God, we talked about snakes, we talked about hunting. I mean, we talked about everything, and eventually we came out of this deep oak savanna wood and into this field, and we got stuck in deep mud. And you know, Alyssa's at the wheel, and she's putting it in and out of gear, and just mud shooting everywhere. And I'm here in like my dress clothes, thinking I was dressing nicely to come see people, and we're just stuck. And while we're there, you know, we let the car settle, and we talk and talk and talk, and every once in a while she puts it in gear and tries again, and it was just like, at one point I said to them, you know, I've never seen these parts of Walpole Island. I've lived here my whole life, and people taught me to be afraid to come here. And you know, Bill looked at me and goes, yeah, he goes, you know, there's, and I won't use, you know, I'll use indigenous instead of what he referred to at that point, but he said, yeah, there's scary indigenous people in the woods, don't you know? He goes, you could get caught. And I said, yeah, you know, I probably was one of those people who used to believe that you know, this was a place to be afraid of. Very honestly to him, you know, I would have been afraid of you at some point in my life. And so it was like this incredible moment after hours of talking to them and viewing all these ceremonial spots and talking and seeing these points that were so important to their history and their lives and their beliefs. And you know, he showed me where the Indian agent picked him up and took him and brought him to Mohawk, and so we're stuck in this mud, and all of a sudden the car moves just a little, and you can hear Bill in the back seat just so calm, describing to his daughter what needs to happen next and how to move forward. And you know, we moved a little bit sideways, and we creeped forward a little bit more, and then he's just calmly describing, you know, all this stuff. And I thought, here's a man that's been through so much in his life, and he's been stuck before, and we've all been stuck before in our ideas about the person sitting next to me and her about the person sitting next to her. And eventually, after hours and hours of conversation, we moved forward just a tiny bit, and then when it felt right, we gunned it, and we moved forward a lot together. And I thought that was such just like a metaphorically powerful moment where I was so stuck in my own ways of thinking. And I almost went through like a therapy out there in the bush with them about like what I used to believe about you and what they used to believe about me. And then we were stuck for all these years together, and then we got unstuck together. And I just like, it was so just like, I don't know. Writing this book was such a powerful experience to me. And I really hope that as people read it, which I've been so blessed to see so many people read it, that people move forward just a tiny bit and have a conversation with anybody at the dinner table about something that's in here, and that's all that it's about. People ask me, did you get rich? It's like, no, didn't. Probably spent more, like driving to all the events for this than I will ever make for this. But I got rich in so many other ways, and I just hope that the kids that I know in those towns that are so hateful might pick it up, and because they love sports or something, and eventually they're going to have a conversation and they're going to get unstuck just like I did. And that was just so important to me, and to put my arm on Dorothy Wright Wallace and feel my family there, and to sit next to Alyssa, and then she texted me the next day, and I don't even know the word, but she used the Ojibwe term for like cousin from another family, and I was like, you referred to me as that. That's so like, it's just so powerful, and so I wanted to preserve the stories, and I hope that you read it and talk about it, and then don't worry about buying a second copy. Just give it to someone else, and encourage them to give it to someone else, and encourage them to give it to someone else until the pages are so tattered that we've all had a conversation about our area through sport, which might not be your thing, and it doesn't matter, because you're really going to find that there's not a heck of a lot of sports in here, but there is, but they all just happen to play sports. But anyways, I thank you so much for having me to talk to you. I would gladly take any questions or listen to any of your stories. I actually like doing it in a small group. I wouldn't have cared before, probably, and that's a really awful thing to say, but in high school, I don't know what I would have thought. I really wish I had a different answer than the one I just gave, but I firmly believe in telling the truth.
Yeah.
And gets me
So
in
what's
trouble
your
on a daily
reaction
basis.
now?
My reaction now is complete sadness and empathy and a desire to learn something. And we're all raised in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
You know that as well as anyone. And I don't think it's my fault that I was raised in that way, but it's my fault if I continue to act in that way, and I don't change that. And that's, I did live in that fault for a long time, and right now my feeling about residential schools is we're not doing enough.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't know what to do other than to listen more, and that's as I said, the biggest thing I listened to or learned here was when you press a record button, there's something powerful about shutting up for an hour and letting someone else speak their truth for as long as they need to speak their truth, and then not responding, but digging deeper again still. Responding, I think, is maybe the wrong methodology, because it puts our own interpretation on someone else's life and history, but asking more questions. And that's what I think we should probably be doing, is letting Indigenous people lead this healing, reconciliation, truth. We're only at the truth part, we're not at the reconciliation part, right? We know what happened, I think. I hope most people know what happened. But we haven't fixed anything, that's for sure.
I
So
I
do you
don't
think
think they
there's
are.
much change from the time, say, way back to?
Drive on to Walpole Island and come back to me in a week or two, and you will see the immense poverty there, and there is nothing that has changed in terms of the way.
But I mean, as far as the lifestyle,
Well, look at all the
because
all the
people
grocery
still
stores
are
and
having
all
that,
kids, like, they're still doing
that
it.
type of feeling.
They are still having that
Anyway.
type of feeling. I think that no, I don't think so. I don't think a lot has changed. I think we've changed the way that we portray it. It's not segregation of you can't come into my business. It's a different type of oppression that's deeper within us, that we still find the same systemic barriers are there.
Yeah.
But I mean, like I said, if you go to Walpole Island First Nation, the poverty level that you would see there is incredible. It's incredible. And it's
not a
awful.
done up reserve at all?
No. There are parts
Some
that
of them
there's
are-
some parts that are beautiful.
Yeah.
But and of course, the issues that exist there are generational trauma, right? It's not that alcoholism and all these things were a portion of Indigenous life. It was the trauma that
root
was
causes
caused.
they have high causes of adversity, so
Right.
high ACE scores.
And I talk about that with like the Boomer Harding story. So people say, well, because I'm a hockey writer, right, for the hockey news and things like that, and people say, well, it's gone. So why aren't there more black people in the NHL? They just don't like hockey. And I was like, no, Boomer Harding wasn't allowed to go to an arena. So you can't teach your kids how to skate if you can't go learn how to skate.
Yeah.
The stereotypes of swimming and black populations. Well, no public pools, no public beaches, no swimming at all. And then as soon as they desegregated pools, you know what they did? People started building pools in their backyards in the suburbs to avoid swimming alongside people of color. Examples of sport though, why aren't there as many black people in the NHL? Well, it's a very clear historical reason. It's not that black people don't enjoy hockey. It's that it was talking about that is the same with the Indigenous communities, the remote communities in the north where the travel is more, but hockey was, so Mel and Herb Wakabayashi even here too, like their families were first exposed to hockey in Japanese internment camps, and those two, Herb Wakabayashi and Mel were probably the two greatest ever hockey players to represent Japan at the Olympic Games, because they eventually not went back to Japan, they'd never been to Japan in their lives. They were born in Canada, they were Canadians. But of course, after World War II, people were given the option to be, as they said, repatriated, even though, it was basically being sent away. But they were great. They were amazing. And the power of those games and the power to exclude using those games and to send, think of where arenas are right now. They're all in the rich upscale suburbs too, without public transit connecting most of them. So it's not like the barriers aren't still there to this day. So you are so right.
Oh, I was just going to say that David Suzuki was in an internment camp as a young child as well too, and also lived in Leamington for a while. His family, and famous Canadian architect Raymond Moriyama was in an internment camp. I heard him talk about that twice when I lived in Toronto.
Yeah, I think that's a part of our history that's really not been talked about as much as the Japanese internment. And the truth of it, how Canada paid for that, right? Like, took people's houses, their automobiles, their boats, and sold them to then intern people, forcefully dispossessing them from their homes and using the money from the sales of those.
What years was that?
World War
Second
II,
War.
until about 1949. It ended after World War II, but Japanese Canadians weren't given the right to vote until years later, and given full rights back until almost 1950. So it was, and split up families, right? Like sending, like Bob Zoom, or not Bob, but his dad Joe, because he was a fit younger man, was separated from the rest of his family and sent to work at farms and road camps and things like that. Well, his mother and sisters and things were across the country, and when the war ended, topics that, when we talk about this book, when my publishing company put out the information, it talks about our false narrative about ourselves and this reputation that we, and in Chatham, if you research Chatham, Kent, which I know that, I did a big talk for the Amherstburg Museum here as well, and Chatham, Kent's history is incredible. Like, it is incredible. The people that were there, like Frederick Douglass was there, and Marianne Shadd, Carey, and the raid on Harper's Ferry, which started the entire Civil War, was planned in Chatham. Like, it is this incredible history tying our whole region and Tecumseh. Like, Tecumseh is explained so. I spent almost a whole chapter on Tecumseh in this book, and not the town of Tecumseh, but the person of Tecumseh. And
Chief Tecumseh.
yes, in the town of Tecumseh, which was founded by a bunch of French people. which I don't know why they named it Tecumseh, but it shouldn't be.
Right.
You know, there's so many things about that are just wrong, and when we're coming to this, I don't know who brought it up here saying about renaming things, and it's a big thing right now, which is birds. Did you hear about this in the news?
Yeah.
And blackbirding was a practice of coercing Indigenous and Black people into slavery. So it took about 24 hours until that got changed. And I think the new name is going to be the North Stars, which will be a really nice
The
name.
school or?
No, our baseball team that we just got chatted. So
Oh,
they
okay.
called it the Chatham Camp Blackbirds originally, which I think they did because they thought it tied to crows, which we have
Yeah.
lots of.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to name it crows because of Jim Crow, which is great, but then they didn't research blackbirding. So, you know, it's an ongoing. Anyways,
You know, the one
any
thing
questions?
that-
I'm sorry, I just kept talking.